Welcome to Modeling Mastery, the podcast where we explore the art and science of software design. I'm Hex.
And I'm Byte. In our last set of episodes, we explored Chapter 1 and the fundamental why of domain-driven design. Why it's a necessary tool for fighting software complexity.
Today, we're taking our first steps into the how by diving into Chapter 2, Domains, Subdomains, and Bounded Contexts. This is where DDD strategic design patterns begin. If the why is the motivation for our journey, this chapter is the satellite view, the high-level map we need before we can even explore the territory on foot.
Exactly. We're zooming out to see the entire landscape of the business. It's about understanding the boundaries of the problem before we can even think about designing the solution. So, for our first episode, let's start with the largest concepts on that map.
Byte, after we've decided that our project is complex enough for DDD, the book says our first task is to understand the landscape. This starts with the biggest concept of all, the domain. The book defines it simply as what an organization does and the world it does it in.
So for a company like an online retailer, the domain is everything related to e-commerce. It's their entire business, selling products, managing inventory, handling payments, shipping orders. It's the whole universe of their operations.
Precisely. And the first and most common architectural mistake is to try and build one single, monolithic model for that entire universe, the dreaded enterprise model. The book is very clear that attempting to define the business of even a moderately complex organization in a single, all-encompassing model will usually fail. Getting all stakeholders across a large business to agree on one pure global meaning for every concept is nearly impossible.
Instead, the book tells us to break that large domain down into its constituent parts, which it calls subdomains. This makes immediate practical sense. Using the online retailer example from the book, you wouldn't say that managing the product catalog is the same business function as handling shipping logistics. The product catalog subdomain is all about rich descriptions, marketing copy, and high-resolution images for shoppers. The shipping subdomain doesn't care about any of that. It cares about an item's weight, dimensions, and customs codes. They are fundamentally different, though related, parts of the overall business.
This is where the strategic part of strategic design really kicks in. DDD insists that not all subdomains are created equal. The most crucial one is what the book calls the core domain. This isn't just another part of the business, it's the part that is of primary importance to the success of the organization. It's the secret sauce, what gives the company its unique competitive advantage. This is where the business must excel, and it's where we must focus our best people and our most sophisticated modeling efforts.
So for our retailer, maybe their core domain isn't just selling books online, but a complex, innovative forecasting system that allows them to perfectly optimize their inventory, something the book touches on. That's the thing that lets them compete with the giants. That forecasting engine is their core domain.
Exactly. And every other part of the business exists to support that core. The book classifies these other parts into two categories. First, there are supporting domains. These are parts of the business that are essential, but not the primary differentiator. They often require a custom solution because an off-the-shelf product doesn't quite fit the business's unique needs, but you're not trying to be the best in the world at it.
Right. And finally, there are generic domains. These are the solved problems of the business world. Things like sending an email, or in the book's example, a geographical mapping service to find directions to a warehouse. A generic domain is something you should almost always solve with an off-the-shelf component or third-party service. You gain no competitive advantage by building your own from scratch.
This classification is incredibly powerful because it's a guide for investment. You pour your energy, your best developers, and your most rigorous DDD modeling efforts into the core domain. You build a simpler, good enough solution for a supporting domain, and you buy, don't build, a solution for a generic domain.
This whole exercise, identifying the domain and classifying its subdomains, is what the book calls analyzing the problem space. We are mapping the business itself, understanding its different parts and their strategic importance. The book even suggests doing this as a literal whiteboard time exercise. Draw your domain and try to identify the subdomains you interact with every day.
It's a crucial first step. We have to analyze the problem before we can architect the solution. And it's that solution, the software itself, that brings us to the next critical concept. Once we understand the problem space through subdomains, we can start to define the boundaries of our solution, which is what the bounded context is all about.
Welcome back to Modeling Mastery. I'm Hex.
And I'm Byte. In our last set of episodes, we explored Chapter 1 and the fundamental why of domain-driven design. Why it's a necessary tool for fighting software complexity.
Today, we're taking our first steps into the how by diving into Chapter 2, Domains, Subdomains, and Bounded Contexts. This is where DDD's strategic design patterns begin. If the why is the motivation for our journey, this chapter is the satellite view, the high-level map we need before we can explore the territory on foot.
Exactly. We're zooming out to see the entire landscape of the business. It's about understanding the boundaries of the problem before we can even think about designing the solution. So, for our first episode, let's start with the largest concepts on that map.
Title: Episode 2, Drawing the Lines, Bounded Contexts. Last time, we mapped out the problem space using domains and subdomains. Now we need to transition to the solution space. How do we actually draw the lines around our software? This brings us to DDD's most critical strategic pattern, the bounded context.
This is a huge aha moment for me. If a domain is a part of the business problem, a bounded context is the boundary we draw around our software model. The book defines it as an explicit boundary within which a domain model exists. The key is that it's primarily a linguistic boundary.
Precisely. Inside a bounded context, every term in our ubiquitous language has a specific, unambiguous meaning. The book says context is king. Think about the word product. In a sales context, a product is defined by its price, name, and SKU. But in a shipping context, that same real-world product is defined by its weight, dimensions, and whether it's hazardous. They are two different models of the same conceptual thing.
And the book shows what happens when you ignore this. The Sassovation team initially mixed their collaboration model with an identity and access model. They had user and permission concepts tangled up with forum and discussion concepts. It created a mess because the language was all mixed up. A change to a security concept rippled through their collaboration features.
The correct approach, which they eventually discovered, was to have two separate bounded contexts. An identity and access context, where the model is all about users and roles, and a separate collaboration context, where the model speaks exclusively in terms of authors and moderators. You create a clean, explicit boundary around each model's language.
So the ideal goal is to align one bounded context with one subdomain, like having an inventory bounded context that implements the inventory subdomain. But the book points out that legacy systems are often a big ball of mud, one giant bounded context that incorrectly covers lots of different subdomains.
And it's important to realize that a bounded context isn't just the domain objects. It's the boundary around the whole solution for that model, including its UI, its application services, and its database schema. It's the boundary of a deployable service or application.
So this is the real first act of architectural design in DDD. Forget classes and methods for a minute. The first decision is, where are our linguistic boundaries? Getting that right seems to prevent a whole category of architectural problems from ever taking root.
So, we've established what a bounded context is, this explicit linguistic boundary. The practical question for any developer is, okay, what does that actually mean for my code base and my team?
The book gives some really concrete answers to the first part. A bounded context isn't just an abstract idea on a whiteboard. It often maps directly to a single source code project in your IDE. In the Java world, its root package would be something like com.sassovation.collaboration. It's the collection of code that gets compiled and deployed together as a single unit, like a jar file, a web application, or a service.
Which naturally leads to the question of size. How big should a bounded context be? The book's answer is wonderfully elegant. It quotes Mozart from the film Amadeus, who, when told his piece had too many notes, replied that it had just as many notes as I required, neither more nor less. A bounded context should be exactly as big as it needs to be to fully express its ubiquitous language.
And the book is very clear about what should not drive the size. You don't create a new bounded context just to align with a technical layer or, and this is a big one, to distribute tasks among developers. You don't create a new bounded context just because you have a new developer on the team. The boundary has to be linguistic, not organizational.
That reinforces another key guideline from the chapter. Ideally, you should have one team per bounded context. The reason is to protect the integrity of that ubiquitous language. If you have two different teams working on the same model, they will inevitably develop slightly different dialects, and the language will start to fracture. A single cohesive team ensures the language stays pure.
This focus on language is so central it even influences small decisions like package naming. The book points out the Sassovation team chose com.sassovation.agilepm for their agile project management context, not com.sassovation.projectovation, which was the product's brand name. They named the package after the domain concept, not the marketing brand, because that's what the ubiquitous language demanded.
This brings us to a final, very practical piece of advice from the chapter for when you're unsure. What do you do if two concepts seem related, but you're not sure if they belong in the same context or separate ones?
The book's advice is to favor keeping them together initially. Use a module, which is just a package or a namespace, to create a simpler, less rigid boundary between them within the same bounded context. You only make the bigger architectural decision to split them into separate bounded context when that linguistic divide becomes sharp, explicit, and undeniable. It's a great heuristic to avoid fragmenting your architecture too early.
We've successfully defined the bounded context as our essential external linguistic boundary. Now let's step inside that boundary. What are the actual software components that make up a bounded context? What is its internal shape?
This is such an important topic because the book makes it very clear that a bounded context is more than just the domain model. It's easy for developers to hear domain-driven design and think it's only about the objects in the domain layer, but the book defines a bounded context as the boundary around the entire application or service that brings that model to life.
Right. At the very center, of course, is the domain model itself, the aggregates, entities, and value objects that are the pure expression of the ubiquitous language. This is the heart, the primary occupant of the context, but it doesn't live in a vacuum.
Exactly. Surrounding that model, you have the other essential pieces. The book explicitly includes the application services, that layer of thin orchestrators that manage the use cases. They are the direct clients of the model and live squarely inside the context. And importantly, the user interface that presents the model and allows users to interact with it is also part of the context.
The book includes a crucial warning here. Stating that the UI is inside the context is not an invitation to put business logic in the UI. That's what it calls the smart UI anti-pattern. The UI should be a presentation and input mechanism, but it is a first-class citizen of that specific solution, speaking the same language as the backend model it's presenting.
That makes sense. The UI for the shipping context will naturally have fields for weight and dimensions, while the UI for the sales context will have fields for price and discounts. They are distinct UIs for distinct models.
And this leads to perhaps the most radical idea for developers coming from a traditional data-first background, the database schema. The book argues that if the schema is designed for the model and by the same team, then that schema is considered inside the bounded context. Its table and column names should reflect the ubiquitous language.
That's a huge departure from the world where a separate DBA team hands you a pre-normalized schema and you have to contort your object model to fit it.
Here, the domain model is the primary citizen, and the database is just an implementation detail for persistence. The diagrams in the chapter really help visualize this. If you look at the identity and access context diagram, for example, you see all the domain components, aggregates like user and role, value objects, domain events, and then right there at the bottom, a box explicitly labeled identity and access schema. It's all part of one cohesive, self-contained system.
So a bounded context contains the full vertical slice of functionality required to deliver a specific business capability. It's the model, the application logic that uses the model, the UI that presents it, and the persistence that saves it, all unified by a single, consistent language. This is powerful because it decouples your strategic business architecture from your specific technical architecture. A business might have a shipping context for the next decade, but the technology used to implement it can evolve independently within that boundary.
And even though we're talking about components that sound like they belong in a traditional layered architecture, the bounded context itself is architecturally neutral. The book emphasizes this. The boundary just defines the playground. How you arrange the components inside, whether it's with layers, a hexagonal architecture, or something else, is a separate tactical decision.
Exactly. It provides the boundary for linguistic consistency, but it doesn't dictate the internal implementation style. Understanding that a context is this complete self-contained system is the key to seeing how different contexts can then be integrated, which is where the real power of strategic design truly begins to emerge.